Welcome back. I'm Professor David Holden. I'm a military historian and a veteran. All these views are my own, in no way represent the U.S. Army or the federal government. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Ukraine. So let's get to it. So how does Putin view the Ukraine? Well, there are a number of possibilities. None of them are good if you view Ukraine. They're just varying degrees of terrible. So for Putin, who used to be an ex-KGB officer, he saw the fall of the Soviet Union to be one of the great travesties of the 20th century, if not of all Russian history.
Ready to go down in history?
The Ukraine used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1774, the Russians got it from the Ottomans, and it remained part of Russia until after World War I. After World War I, it became its own state, only to be reabsorbed about 3 years later by the modern Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, then the Ukraine became a state unto itself once again. Possibility number 2. He wants a mulligan.
That's your mulligan, Mr. Ward.
That's right. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, he really didn't like how that went down. Being an ex-KGB officer, according to him, he ended up even having to drive taxis after the fall of the Soviet Union to make ends meet. Number 3. Putin sees Ukraine within its sphere of influence.
You are making an unwarranted incursion, a gradual or stealthy entrance into the sphere of another.
Now, all great powers have spheres of influence. So we have a sphere of influence, for example. Dating back to 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine, we pretty much said all those European countries that are trying to colonize, we pretty much said, hey, North America, off limits. Later on, we updated that with the Roosevelt corollary, which pretty much says not only is North America off limits, but so is Central and South America. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? That was an example of Russia trying to put missiles within our sphere of influence. We drew a red line that says, you shall not pass. That is not going to happen. Now, some of this comes down to a term called realpolitik. It's a German word. It pretty much means that you are making practical decisions and you're not making them based on moral considerations or on ideological considerations. So, for example, if we were to look at the Ukraine through a moral lens, we'd say, well, the Ukraine has a right to be a sovereign nation. And as such, all Western powers should stand up for the Ukraine. That would be taking a moral stance that Putin shouldn't invade the Ukraine, and if he does, we're going to stand up and fight alongside the Ukraine. Realpolitik pretty much says, we're not going to war for the Ukraine, and I don't think anybody else is either. Point number 4 is closely related to point number 1. The Ukraine, which used to be called New Russia, in fact, Putin even refers to it as that in several speeches, which is kind of the southern part of the Ukraine. In Putin's mind, he says, hey, old Russia, new Russia should be reunited. Point number 5 is Putin's New Year's resolution. I mean, what possibly could be a better New Year's resolution than bringing new Russia and old Russia back together? Now, the reason he might be doing this also is because life inside of Russia may not be going all that great.
What? Not great.
And when you have troubles at home, sometimes a great way to unite everybody behind you is to focus on external threat. And so by forcing an external threat on the outside, and that has a uniting function on everybody inside of Russia. This was quite common during the days of the Soviet Union, where you look beyond the borders and say, hey, look at all those dangerous capitalists out there.
Capitalist vermin!
They're looking to take over Russia as a way to justify the internal police organizations that, like the KGB, that dominated internal security for Soviet Union. And point number 6 is that obviously he wants to limit the influence of the European Union and even more so NATO.
Did I catch a niner in there?
And that's what's really, I think, triggered him here. Besides the desire to absorb the Ukraine back into the Soviet Union, it's the threat of having a NATO state on his border. And this is understandable. If you could imagine Russia camping out in Canada or Mexico, we might feel the same way. It doesn't justify it, but you can understand how it might make him a bit jittery. So the Ukraine is in the unenviable position of being situated between Europe and Russia. And as a result, it's often the highway between these great powers when there's conflicts that break out. Furthermore, the Ukraine has had a very dark and tragic history. In the early 1930s, Stalin, concerned about uprisings from the Ukrainians, pretty much took their food, all of it. The average life expectancy for a female in 1933 was 10 years old. And 7 for males. And if that wasn't bad enough, when the Nazis invade in 41, on their way to Moscow, of course, you have to traverse through Poland and then through the Ukraine. En route between 1941 and 1944, the average life expectancy for females was 25, and the average life expectancy for a male was 15. And during the occupation of the Nazis, anywhere between 8 to 14 million Ukrainians were killed. and another 2 million were taken off to Nazi Germany to be used as slaves.
Y'all think America's Satan, right?
So you're starting to see what life was like for the Ukrainians in much of the 20th century. It wasn't pleasant. You either had mass starvation or massive murder or slavery, or all of the above, actually. This problem has no simple solution because right now there are roughly 100,000 Russian troops massed on the border of the Ukraine. See, much of eastern Ukraine over the years has had a large influx of ethnic speaking Russians. So the big question is Putin going to be satisfied
If you are satisfied, press 1.
with just getting the ethnic speaking regions back into Russia proper, or does he have grander designs? Does he want all of New Russia back? Remember, that's the southern part of the Ukraine. But New Russia accounts for roughly 60% of the GDP of the Ukraine, so it'd be a pretty big hit to them. Furthermore, Putin's designs is he wants a warm weather port. Well, the warm weather port that he gets in Crimea, that's the only warm weather port that all of Russia has. So for him, this has great strategic consequence. The problem is, of course, Hitler did something like this during the 30s as well, because the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, the outer rim of Czechoslovakia, a great deal of ethnic-speaking Germans. So when Hitler wanted to reoccupy it, most of the other European powers condemned it, but then they're kind of like, well, what are you going to say? It's got an awful lot of ethnic-speaking Germans there. It kind of makes sense. Of course, Hitler went on to take all of Czechoslovakia thereafter. So with respect to the Ukraine, you can see how it makes logical sense that the Russians in eastern Ukraine might want to rejoin Russia proper. Putin might also want to reabsorb them. However, the big question is, will it end there? Unlikely, I think.
Trust me, I know what I'm talking about.
Now, if it comes down to a military contest, it ain't much of a contest, let me tell you. The Ukrainians are outmatched, really, by every metric. Now, for Putin, this is a pretty big gamble. If this divulges into a insurgency, that could very rapidly increase the cost for Putin. Furthermore, unlike in 2014, the Ukrainians are far better prepared this time around. The Ukraine would lose by all metrics, but if this turns into insurgency and where there are small groups of Ukrainian soldiers running around ambushing and shooting and sniping Russian soldiers, this could become very unpopular for Putin at home. So what has the response of the international community been to this manufactured crisis by Putin on the border of Ukraine? Well, they're threatening sanctions and political and economic sanctions of some sort. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that seems kind of weak.
Men are weak. The race of men is failing.
Fair enough. But let me start by saying, first of all, America is not going to war for the Ukraine. The British aren't going to save the Ukrainians. The Germans, the Poles, the French, nobody is going to go to war with the Russians over the Ukraine. Would you send your father, your son, your mother, or your daughter to go fight and die in the Ukraine? Unlikely. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that would be the moral thing, that would be the just thing to do, but Russia is a nuclear power.
Вы только что предотвратили ядерную войну.
No one wants to get into conventional conflict, which always has the potential of escalating, and nobody wants to have the world come to an end fighting over the Ukraine. It's unfortunate, but that's just the truth of it.
You see if his eyes can convince you of the truth.
So the G7 recently got together. That's countries like Japan, Italy, United States, Canada, France, and the British, I believe, got together, and they threatened political and economic sanctions. Now, have sanctions been particularly effective against Russia? Not all that much. But this time, they're threatening to really ratchet up the pain on them. You can also go after the oligarchs. Putin may not be particularly concerned about much back in Mother Russia, but he is very much concerned about the oligarchs. And if those billionaires can't travel around in their yachts,
There's no yacht.
throughout much of Europe and go into port on their yacht and refuel them and travel around and go skiing in the Alps, that really could cause Putin some problems at home. We could also, and we started doing this, we could provide more weapons to the Ukrainians. We've been providing them anti-tank missiles, so more robust support from Nato. And then there's also the Nord Stream, the oil pipeline that's being built to Germany. That's another place where potentially they could cancel that project. I think the Germans are reluctant to go that way. So those are all things that can be done to ratchet up the pressure on Putin, amongst other factors. So my opinion, what do I think the Russians are going to do? 60-40, 60% he's not going to invade, 40% he does. Here's why I say that. There's way too many eyes on the Ukraine right now, and the political and economic pain that might be brought his way, I think might stay his hand for right now, because I think he believes that he can get the Ukraine through other means, piecemeal, if you will.
The next step of your master plan.
He has this is standard operating procedure for the Soviets, right? They like to mass enemy forces on a border of a country, and then they see what kind of concessions they can get from you. 2014, they also annexed the Crimea. And if you remember, they had the little green men, pretty much Russian soldiers with no insignia, marched across in the Crimea. Again, you have the same problem that there are an awful lot of ethnic Russians there. And the Donetsk region here in eastern Ukraine with a lot of ethnic Russians, I think he might just try to get that piecemeal. Also in the eyes of Russia, he looks like a hero right now.
You're a real hero.
Stood up to the United States and much of the international community, and then eventually through other means by interfering with elections to supporting insurgencies. I think he believes that over time that he can absorb elements of the Ukraine. Putin might also be hoping that by having forces in the region, he can provoke some kind of firefight or incident that would justify invasion. This has happened many times before in history. We did it in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 in Vietnam. Hitler did the same thing before he invaded Poland. He said that there was a firefight and the Polish had attacked I believe it was a radio station on the border, and that justified the invasion of all of Poland. It's like getting in a fight over the OK Corral, and rather than just taking the city, you just seize the whole state. If you like this current events update, please give me a thumbs up, and you can support me at davidwholden.com at my website or at Patreon. Links down below. Thank you.